Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. We have another review for you, this time for Don't Die July 2025. Today we're talking about The Clatter Man by Janelle Schiecke. I apologise if I've just butchered that name. So this came out on May the 6th of 2025. The Kindle edition that I have read came in at 212 pages long. As always, we shall talk about the story, characters, world building and presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end of the video, so let's just dive straight in. Clatter Man is a fascinating example of a story that doesn't step particularly far outside the bounds of what is normal for the genre, but does it really, really well. So the basic story of this one, and there's a load of stuff here which you'll have seen in other slasher horrors elsewhere. You have a group of young people, specifically a group going into their senior year at college, going to a remote location, in this case a lakeside woodland cabin, for a bit of a summer blowout, a bit of a get-together with the friends before senior year begins. Whilst at this remote location, ghost stories are told, and they decide, or someone in the group decides, to act on something said within this tale, which ends up summoning something. Specifically in this case, the Clatter Man, who is this hulking monstrosity of a person who can be summoned using a blood ritual and then hunts everybody down and kills them. If this feels a bit Freddy Krueger style, you are absolutely right. There is a lot of echoes of that in here, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The first half of the book is very much set to introduce these characters, get us invested in them, and then questionable decision is made, and then you have what I would call your general slasher rundown as the Clatter Man goes in and one by one starts to pick off this group of people until you're left with the survivors or survivor, as it varies by story. And it is incredibly well executed in the story it is telling. This is a narrative scaffolding that works really well for this genre. You build this sort of level of sympathy for your characters and then kill them off one by one. And you have these small nuances that run through it. And it's in the nuances that this story really does excel. I don't think the story is in itself, in terms of structure, particularly original. A lot of the stuff here you will have seen elsewhere. But this is executed so well that really doesn't matter and makes this a really engaging read. So we have 6 primary characters in this, although they're not all created equal, but they do all serve, I should say, a purpose. Starting with Abby, who is our MC of the story, arguably. She is an interesting take on the semi-shy, nervous but competent female lead. This is very much a character driven by their own past trauma and their own leanings in terms of the paranormal as well, and things that they have seen, which adds an interesting wrinkle into the conversation when it comes to the legend of the Clatter Man itself. Now, Abby's best friend Val is kind of the polar opposite. This is someone who is hyper brash, hyper confident, very much knows what they want and goes about it however they wish. Very, very invested in the supernatural because they've seen no evidence of it. Invested in a skeptic's sort of way, so are quite happy to whip out the Ouija board because they don't really believe in it because they've never experienced it. The opposite of Abby, who has experienced it and believes and wants to avoid that. You then have Ben, who is the perfect boyfriend, so to speak, for Abby. This confident, good-looking, charming, pretty confident guy. And kind of the glue in many regards that holds this group together as well. You have their best friend Jamie, who is kind of the polar opposite in many regards. Very much the shy, quiet, nervous type, who is also at this point dating Val. And finally you have Dustin, who has some history with Abby, where they were rejected by Abby earlier on in their life. And you have this almost fish out of water character here who is very much the third wheel of the group, but this wouldn't be happening without them. And they all fit the various different roles that you normally get in slasher films for like the group of the hunted, but with plenty of personality. They each fit their roles perfectly, and there's just a slight skewing of each of them, which adds a level of interest, especially when it comes to when the slaughter begins. You can probably guess who goes first, but it still hits because of how well the banter and the chemistry is between this group right at the beginning. Of course, the other character to mention is the Clatter Man themselves, and they are portrayed initially more as a force of nature, as is often the case in such stories, but you have this fascinating unpeeling, and you have this urban legend spoken about, and this is an occasion where the urban legend is, or at least on its surface, appears to be pretty accurate actually to how the Clatter Man came about. And you get this unpeeling, and you get the look through his own memories of what he went through. And whilst this is an irredeemable monster in many regards, you can kind of see how he got there. And it gives him a sympathetic bent, although certainly not someone you would ever root for in this. And again, none of these sort of archetypes are particularly groundbreaking, but they're all done exceptionally well. The Clatter Man feels menacing, feels like they've left their humanity behind, but there's just a sliver there. You have the competence and the brash ego and the confidence of the group around as they interact with each other, and it just works to perfection, which does show a great understanding of this genre. World building and setting, not a huge amount to really talk about here. I really do like how the Clatter Man is introduced in terms of their own place in history, going into what their job was, how they were initially regarded in the world before they became successful, and then their fall from grace as they lost everything, and how society turned on a dime on them. And I really do like that. It does drive home the thought of nobody likes anything better than someone who's successful that then falls. I really like that. A lot of the other storytelling was quite passive, but you have plenty of things that set this perfectly as a 90s based story in terms of the communication, the cars, the sense of isolation at this sort of A-frame cabin in the woods. All works really well, and it drives home this sort of landscape of desolation that they kind of have to pass through before they get to the woods. And on the escape path, this sense of impending dread that we've already kind of been introduced to early on, with the purely geographic style of storytelling worked exceptionally well, and again foreshadows some of the Clatter Man's history and nods back to that as well, so that works really well. And the actual cabin itself does still have a level of personality. This picturesque, scenic view that everybody wants. This is somewhere that everybody wants to go on holiday to, and nearly nobody can get. So that sense of exclusivity comes through as well. And it works really, really well to ground this as a special place, and not just a special place, but a special time for these characters that goes from being a dream to a nightmare that really does inform the storytelling. But yeah, it's still incredibly passive in how it does that and very organic feeling, which I really did appreciate. So as mentioned earlier, this is a case of a book that executes itself exceptionally well in terms of what it's trying to do, and that comes across most of all in its presentation. Starting with the cover, you have this evil, brutal looking hook on the end of a chain, which is one of the weapons, or the primary weapon that the Clatter Man uses. Also very timely for the character as well, as it's explained in the backstory. But also with the grayscale background, this sort of depressed hopelessness that really sort of pervades the back quarter of the book, in particular as the Clatter Man closes in on the last of their victims, really does work for the tone of this book. Now, in terms of the way this book is sort of presented, I really like the way that you have such a swift and brutal prologue that introduces the Clatter Man character without really knowing who or what they are before pivoting away to start to introduce our primary cast of victims or protagonists, whichever you choose to use. And the way that they're introduced works really organically, each leaning into a link with another one before moving into the next and establishing this web of relationships that works really, really well. And it is a bit slow to get going, but I think that's to the story's benefit as we begin to see the banter between the characters. These are characters that do get along as a rule of thumb, although not entirely. We get a sense of history with them, and that is allowed time to build and breathe. And then you can start to see where you're going to get these conflicts coming. And as that begins to build up, we sort of hit this peak as the Clatter Man story is told. And when the decision is made by one of the group to perform the ritual that summons the Clatter Man, believing that it wouldn't happen, you have this sense of sudden dread, and you have this very slow build up for a couple of chapters after that before all hell breaks loose, and then it just ramps up to 11 as the Clatter Man goes to town on this group. And as the Clatter Man goes through, it kind of follows exactly the sort of order you would expect it to, although there is a couple of little surprises in there. But it still works exceptionally well because of, first off, how the Clatter Man was initially introduced and how the character work was done for this sort of network of people. And then as it builds up, you then have this sort of dip when people think they're safe and then they realise they're really not, as the environmental storytelling of the place they find themselves in starts to breed into this sense of hopelessness and depression, and they're not going to get away from this. So that works really well. I also like the open-ended nature of the ending of this. I do quite like when horrors sort of lean into the sort of ending that this does without spoiling anything here. Especially with a character like the Clatter Man, who is very much a force of nature at this point rather than human. So I really do think the way that this flows narratively and the way that this is structured is what really brings all this together to work as well as it does, and I think this is masterfully done. Final thoughts then. I really, really liked the Clatter Man. I picked this up specifically for Don't Die July. Interestingly enough, I had forgotten I actually already had a book by the author. I already have Death Cult, which I'm now even more excited to read after reading this one. But I'd seen and heard so much positive buzz about this that I really wanted to cover this month, and it did not disappoint. This is one of my favourite slasher books that I have read. I can't think off the top of my head of one that I actually prefer to it, interestingly enough. Just in terms of execution, this is so well handled in terms of the way the Clatter Man is introduced and the way they are humanized before tearing that away. The organic nature of the friendships, the way the geographic storytelling plays into the mood of the story. It all works so well together, despite not varying too far off what you would class as the standard fare for this genre. So this is an easy recommend for me. If you want some good traditional 90s based slasher fare, I think you will absolutely love this one. But that is my thoughts on The Clatter Man by Janelle Schiecke. Have you read this or anything else by the author? If you have, let me know what you thought of it down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all soon.